Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for attending our session this morning. This is the second in a series of conversations that Leadership Seacoast is hosting on diversity, equity, and inclusion. My name is Lori Waltz-Gagnon. I am the Executive Director of Leadership Seacoast, and I want to welcome you all this morning. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. And I also want to thank our panelists for taking the time out of their day to be here and share their insight and knowledge with us. Um, Please look forward to additional Leadership Seacoast events that we're going to be hosting that are on diversity, equity, and inclusion. In August, we determined that this was a topic that is relevant to not just the Seacoast, but really much broader than that. And we want to make sure that we're providing our alumni and the community an opportunity to engage in these discussions to become better informed about the topic and really the subtopics that fall within diversity, equity, and inclusion. So this morning we're going to talk about accessibility and what that looks like for individuals who have been impacted by either physical or what we've now termed invisible disabilities. So someone who has a cognitive disability or perhaps has a mental health issue. So just a few things that we're going to start off with this morning to put a context and framework around the conversation. I'm going to read to you a couple of definitions that will help sort of keep us within a certain framework about the conversation that's going to occur. I first just want to mention that we recognize that no two people are alike. We all have different individuality, personalities, characteristics, and we recognize that some of the people that are on this call this morning might have a disability, and we appreciate you for being here, and we want to hear your voice too. So I didn't memorize these definitions, so I am going to read them to you. The first term that we want to describe is ableism. Ableism is the discrimination of and social prejudice against people with disabilities based on the belief that typical abilities are superior. At its heart, ableism is rooted in the assumption that disabled people require fixing and defines people by their disability. The second term that we want to cover is diversity. This includes, but is not limited to race, color, ethnicity, nationality, religion, socioeconomic status, veteran status, education, marital status, language, age, gender, gender expression, gender identity, sexual orientation, mental or physical ability, genetic information, and learning styles. That's a big one. The third term we want to cover is equity and what that means. Equity is the guarantee of fair treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement for all while striving to identify and eliminate barriers that have prevented the full participation of some groups. The principle of equity acknowledges that there are historical, underserved, and underrepresented populations, and that fairness regarding these unbalanced conditions is needed to assist equality and the provision of effective opportunities to all groups. And the last term that we want to define is inclusion. Authentically bringing traditionally excluded individuals and or groups into processes, activities, and decision policy making in a way that shares power and ensures equal access to opportunities and resources. The conversation that we're going to have today is really going to come through the lens of everyday life and is not going to be just focused on the workplace. In the research that we had done in preparing for today's session, a lot of the information that we came across really focused on the workplace and what it looks like to either develop a new diversity, equity, and inclusion plan for your workplace, or if you're looking to modify and make adjustments to your plan, that you really want to start with accessibility first. But we're going to talk about more than just the workplace. We're going to be talking about what it means to move about a community if you're an individual who has been impacted with a disability. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to now turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves and let you know a little bit about who they are, where they work, and the focus of what they're going to bring to the conversation today. So Barb, I'm going to have you begin.
I will happen to work in brain injury, a field where perhaps 10 to 15% of the people living with acquired brain injury ultimately end up back employed again, or certainly employed within a field that they're interested in being in. So those numbers are really low. And in my work, which I'll talk about in a moment, it's really the everyday exclusions that they feel that impact their lives and their quality of life so much more. So I think that's really great. And you're right, a lot of the literature reflects what we value as a society, which is people's ability to be productive, and but there's so much more to life than that. So anyway, I'm Barb Kresge. I'm an occupational therapist. I've been an OT since 1991. I've worked with all adults, all across the healthcare spectrum, from intensive care to home care. But for the last 15 years, I've had my dream job. I work at Krempel Center in Portsmouth, and that is a community-based program for adults who are survivors of acquired brain injury. And we have a community that they are part of. And I say it's a dream job because it's the antithesis of kind of the healthcare system. And no offense to anybody who works in the healthcare system, really and truly, I honor what you do. I've done it. But it puts a lot of constraints on the ways in which you can help people. And it can be very challenging to truly meet their needs. So at Krempel Center, we often meet, so I should just say what acquired brain injury. An acquired brain injury is a trauma or a tumor in the central nervous system, usually in the brain, or a disease process that affects the brain, that impacts the brain. And people have, by acquired, it means they have gotten that post-birth and not during the birth process. The large majority of our members have gotten them in their adult years or young adult years, where they've already been, on their life path. And so there's a great deal of loss that they're experiencing. Often the first time that we meet people is that day or very soon thereafter, when the healthcare system has told them, you're done. You're not making progress quickly enough. And so insurance isn't going to pay for you to be here anymore. And from their perspective, they're all but done. And yet they're home, and everything about their life has changed. Depending on how long their rehab has been and how long they were in a coma. We have people who were in comas for 6 months, a year. Most of the people in their lives have moved on. Their lives have continued on. So we get to know people at a time when they're saying, seriously, this is it? This is now what my life is supposed to be? I can't do the things I want to do. All the roles that I had are different. All my relationships are different. So what's really cool is what we know at Krempel Center is that when you offer a community that allows people to be themselves, that allows them to, that encourages and has the value that everybody is deserving of respect, and a sense of belonging, that people can thrive. And I'm not saying everybody in our community thrives, but they're all somewhere on the road towards thriving, heading in that direction. And they feel like they have a place where they belong and a place that they're comfortable. My hope is that ultimately they won't need to find some place like Krempel Center to have those feelings of comfort and the ability to take a risk and to try things and to feel accepted and respected, that our wider community will be like that. And I fully 100% believe that that's all in our hands. This has nothing to do with the folks who are living with disabilities. They are doing the work. They are doing the work every day to get back to their lives, to be part of society, to be part of the world around them. The barriers come from us, be people who don't know how to interact with them or are too uncomfortable, too hesitant to take those risks, and from the environment around us. So I'm hoping that this forum will be really helpful for those of you who are here to find that a little bit more of a comfort level, if that's an issue, to take a risk and notice people in our communities who are having different kinds of challenges. I think that's it.
Thanks, Barb. Anne, would you like to go next?
Sure. I'm Ann Weidman. I'm the Director of Marketing and Community Engagement at JSA Design. We're an architecture firm located at Pease, specializing in senior living, healthcare, higher ed, some multifamily, some mixed use. You see our work all over Portsmouth. And in that role, of course, I know all my colleagues. Todd Hanson, who's on the panel, is one of them. And Todd Hanson had this idea one day to start a nonprofit. Well, at that time it wasn't a nonprofit, it was just an idea of a thing we could do. And it morphed into this thing called Access Navigators that we'll tell you more about later. So, honestly, I sort of came into this as the sidekick to Todd and have kind of morphed into becoming an advocate for people who live with disabilities. So it's been an interesting path for me to travel. Probably you want to do Todd next, and I have slides queued up for Todd, who is a much more prolific speaker than me, as it turns out. I have to be the tech person and do the screen share, and let's see. Here we go, share. I think, are we up? Is that working?
Yep.
Okay, cool. And I'll pass the baton to Todd because we're sort of here as a unit.
I'm Todd Hanson, a principal at JSA Design in Portsmouth. You can't see it, but I'm sitting in a wheelchair, but you can hear that I'm speaking using an iPad. I didn't always have disabilities. I built a career as an architect, designing facilities for people who had physical, cognitive, or emotional challenges. I spent decades paying attention to the needs of individuals who often struggled with profound disabilities. I planned and designed rehabilitation hospitals and long-term care facilities for both kids and adults who suffered incredibly difficult physical hardships. I often spent days and nights listening to them, talking with their loved ones and observing their care. I also specialized in designing behavioral health facilities from coast to coast and even overseas. I took a similar approach to understanding those needs as best I could. I would spend nights in psychiatric hospitals trying to grasp the emotional impact of being in a secured institutional setting, and participated as the lone architect on a national research team grappling with the impact of the environment on patient outcomes. I also happened to be a lifelong, overly competitive runner who blew off stress with over 30 years of daily runs. So I really didn't comprehend what living with a physical impairment meant.
How do I advance a slide? I'm doing the.
It should. Do you have? Can you just use your arrow button or enter?
It's not advancing. I feel like I've had this little conundrum before. Oh,
there we go.
There you go.
But wait, I feel like it went too far. Oh, there we go.
Okay, that was the
That was
first
what I was
one.
looking
That was
for.
the
There's
first one.
Todd as the runner is what it would have advanced to.
Okay.
Todd, am I on to the next slide? Okay. Now it's queuing in.
Quietly high from my 50th birthday, I snuck off on a 4-day solo hike in the White Mountains. Shortly after I snapped that photo, I took an uncharacteristic fall, and that was the first time I noticed that something didn't feel quite right. A couple months later, I found myself sitting in the waiting room at Mass General's ALS clinic. I was surrounded by people who struggled to walk and to talk. I was about to really learn what living with disabilities meant. I ran one last marathon after that, but before long I needed a walker to keep my balance. But soon that wasn't enough. and I began navigating the world from a wheelchair and speaking using this iPad. It's been an eye-opening experience. It took nearly 2 years of repeated testing to finally label my diagnosis as primary lateral sclerosis, which is a cousin of the more common ALS. Unlike ALS, it typically doesn't impact breathing or necessarily shorten your lifespan. So I consider myself fortunate. But now, I have found a calling to raise awareness and make our society more welcoming and inclusive to individuals of all abilities. My new persona has brought me invitations to a number of groups dealing with equity and inclusion. I'm on the Accessibility Committee for the New England Foundation for the Arts, the Boston Society of Architects Accessibility Committee, and a newly forming committee to support employment and education opportunities within the design professions. So far, we have a small but very diverse group from across the US and Europe. None of these groups want special treatment. They just want equitable treatment for all individuals, no matter their abilities.
Okay. I'll stop my screen share there. Okay. Thanks, Todd.
That was cool. So Megan.
Hi. Good morning. My name is Megan Turchetti. I'm a psychologist and I work for Seacoast Mental Health Center. Seacoast Mental Health Center is one of the 10 designated community mental health centers of New Hampshire, serving the southern half of Rockingham County. And we offer outpatient mental health services for, people across the age span. Right now, I am a supervisor for the child and family therapy team in Portsmouth. So I support a group of therapists and case managers and outreach providers, and collaborate with our psychiatry department as well. So right now, my work really involves kind of, the hope of community mental health is that anything can walk through the door. So a very wide range of mental health diagnoses. But in my own career, I've also focused specifically on the treatment of autism spectrum disorders and in the area of trauma and attachment, particularly for young children. So presently, I sit as New Hampshire Psychological Association's representative on the State Autism Council. And I'm also part of a really wonderful committee of New Hampshire Psychological Association, which is our Inclusion and Equity Committee. So I'm really happy to come to you guys today, kind of from the child and family perspective, and also from what we can sometimes look at as the invisible disability perspective of mental illness and people living with a mental health diagnosis.
Excellent. So thanks again, you guys, for being here this morning. I think we have a really well-rounded group to engage in this conversation. So I want to move now to sort of, gosh, we're right on time, you guys. That was amazing. To setting the stage. And Barbara, I think we're going to start with you to sort of talk about what it is that we are talking about today, what it is that we are not talking about today, because this topic is broad, and some language maybe that we need to be introduced to.
Excellent, thank you. I am going to go ahead and share my screen, but I did want to say that while I respect the decision to have everybody on mute, I more than welcome you to be interactive throughout my presentation. I'm going to use slides for just a little bit of this, and please feel free to ask questions, to add your perspective. Let's see, screen 2. All right, are you seeing what is Krempel Center?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so actually I'm going to skip that, except that you can see some fabulous photos from our community. Move on to the next one. So I apologize after Ann and Todd's slides that are colorful and beautiful that I kind of just got to the basics here, but we can focus on the word. So I just wanted to talk about what is the term disability. And I want to say that I'm not sure, I don't know, Todd, did you use it in your presentation at all? What I kept hearing was different or all abilities or the range of different abilities. And so a lot of people don't even use the word disability.
I always
So
think Todd is less sensitive and I'm more sensitive.
yeah, so yeah,
I always
and
go
it's
dancing
really
around
a
for the perfect word and Todd's like, it's okay.
yeah, so
But I think it depends on the person.
great. So I do use the word disability in some contexts, and in this case, we are talking, the forum is, it's right in our title. So what is a disability? Let's just kind of come to an agreement about that. A disability is any condition of the body or mind that can make it more difficult for the person with the condition to do certain activities and interact with the world around them. That's the CDC. Not Tony. Tony didn't do this definition, but this is a CDC definition. And I thought I would, at the same time as we're talking about disabilities, talk about the word handicap, which you really hear incredibly rarely these days. It's kind of an outdated word, but when there are some people who believe in the use of this word in a slightly different way, not as a descriptor for a person, but kind of a situation. A handicap is viewed as a disadvantage resulting from a disability that limits or prevents fulfillment. A handicap can refer to a barrier created by people or by the environment. So for instance, if there is not a curb cut, somebody might have a mobility challenge and they are trying to get around Portsmouth, and there maybe the streets with the cobblestone end up being a handicapping condition that prevent access for that person. So that's an example where the environment is presenting a problem. And I think we can all turn a disability into, we can all create handicaps for people with disabilities by not being open to problem solving and providing, reasonable access.
Todd's
and
chiming in the
accommodations.
chat box, reminding us, we seem to call it handicap parking. There's a place where the terms, we try to say accessible parking.
Accessible parking,
But
yeah.
honestly, that generally towns call it handicapped parking.
Yeah, so that's a good example. It's almost like anti-handicap parking, right? So accessible parking is, I think, what I hear more of these days. So as traditionally used, impairment, and I'm putting it throughout this example, I have an example in there. So for instance, paralysis of the legs refers to a problem with a structure or organ of the body. Disability, which would result from the paralysis of the legs, which could be decreased mobility, requiring a wheelchair to navigate in the community, is a functional limitation with regard to a particular activity. A handicap refers to a disadvantage in filling a role in life relative to a peer group. So for instance, the uneven pavements in Portsmouth are difficult to navigate in a wheelchair, thereby handicap a person who uses a wheelchair for mobility. I'll let you just read that last one. Are you able to see it clearly enough? Is it big enough? Okay, just as an example. Are those relatively clear? Does anybody have issue with that? I will not call myself an expert in this area. I try very hard to be sensitive and to people living with different abilities. But I am not perfect, and I myself may say things today that people may not agree with the use of terminology. Is there anybody that has questions or concerns or thoughts about any of this terminology? No? All right. So I wanted to just give an idea of what the different categories of disabilities are, and they're categorized in thousands of different ways. So I just pulled one particular model that I hoped was going to capture most most conditions that people live with. And so we've got physical or locomotor. So physical conditions that may be reduced strength, reduced range of motion, paralysis, those kinds of things, a poor coordination, or decreased fine motor or gross motor coordination. We've got neurological conditions, which could include things like brain injury. So anything neurological conditions indicates a problem with either the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system are things like brain injury and spinal cord injury, and some of the neurological diseases will directly impact the central nervous system. And then we also have the peripheral nervous system. So even things like carpal tunnel, which hopefully aren't not going to permanently disable folks, could be put in there, but also diseases like PLS and Parkinson's and multiple sclerosis would fit in there. And the interesting thing, certainly about brain injury and about many of the neurological diseases, is that because they impact the central nervous system, you end up with everything you do it could be impacted. So your cognition, which is the way that you think and problem solve, those kinds of things, as well as physical issues, as well as visual and potentially hearing and speech. So all of those things could be impacted. We've got mental health issues, which I'm hoping Megan's going to talk a little bit more about. And mental health conditions, while can be extremely debilitating to folks and really marginalize them in our society, but above and beyond that, they're often coexisting coexisting with the other disabilities, I think, because of the lack of inclusion in society and the changes that people are trying to deal with. Then we also have visual and hearing deficits. I deal with those relative to brain injury, but we don't have any experts here, unless we have any in the audience who are used to working with folks with visual impairments and, for instance, the deaf culture. So I will say right out there, those are really well-established communities, and there's lots of work around them. And I don't think we have real expertise represented amongst us, which doesn't mean we can't talk about them, but I just wanted to put that caveat out there. And then speech, there are a few primary diagnoses that can affect communication, but often it's a byproduct. When I say here it says speech, I would say communication would be maybe even a better term, because communication includes obviously not just your verbal output. But I like that it was separately represented here, because the impact of that is just so huge on people's ability to integrate into the world around them. Does anybody see any holes? Does anybody have any questions? Do you think it kind of sums everything up?
I think it's great. I think
Okay.
it sums it up beautifully.
All right. And I did ask a few questions, if you see on the side there. What are the implications of a visible versus an invisible? Did I spell it? I did. And versus an invisible disability or challenge. And I think that is a very, very, having spent my last 15 years working with brain injury survivors who often have a combination of both, or sometimes just the invisible part. And Megan's nodding her head, because certainly folks living with mental health challenges very often, their behaviors may be visible, which might give you a clue that something invisible is going on. But the fact is that it's hard for us to take off our typical lens that we look through to analyze somebody's behavior, reactions, and interactions if we don't make a really strong attempt to do so. So I do hope there'll be some discussion later on about invisible versus.
Megan, do you want to chime in now? Do you want to have that back and forth?
Sure. Yeah.
Is that
Yeah.
okay with you, Barb?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. So, and I think it kind of dovetails nicely with the idea of setting the frame. So one of the first things that I was thinking about in terms of how do we frame our conversation today was this idea of kind of understanding and accepting implicit bias. So implicit bias is this idea that as humans, one of the ways that we walk through the world is by making these snap judgments, and that's something that right now in our cultural moment we're thinking about in a totally new way, which is so exciting. That's why we're having this panel today. But we're trying to kind of reckon with what does it mean that we make these snap judgments. So there's no way around the fact that as humans, we look at one another. We are socially referencing creatures. And what our brains do is look at one another and we make a snap judgment. And typically it's based off of someone's appearance and someone's behaviors. And when we're doing that, we're not doing that in a kind of like stepping into our, our more advanced mind of what do I think about this person? What are my beliefs about this person? That comes next. But the implicit bias is that snap judgment. It happens before we've even thought about or had an idea about that person. The problem is that quite often those snap judgments that we make, which are really about, is this safe or not safe? Am I going to be comfortable or uncomfortable? When we're not holding awareness of those snap judgments, we let those snap judgments filter through into the thoughts and belief that we have about those other people, about what we expect from them, how we expect to be treated possibly, and then that filters into our actual actions. So whenever we're having conversations like this and we're acknowledging implicit bias, there's a little bit of discomfort because, like I said, like none of us want to think about ourselves in a way of being biased, and yet our minds work in this way where in order to be adaptive creatures, we have to make snap judgments. So the way to get around that, I think, is to really lean into this idea that that is a process and that we have to have that self-examination of, can I reflect about my own reaction to you? Can I be mindful of what is it like for me when I step close to you? And when I get that kind of icky feeling of, oh, I don't know if I'm going to be comfortable, can I examine that? Can I say, what does that mean for me? What is my worry about this situation? And quite often it is about sensitivity. It's about the fact that we're striving to be more sensitive towards one another. And we've not got this figured out quite yet. We're kind of bumping along into things, bumping into one another's sensitivities, and then having to say, can we hold a little grace for one another for the fact that I don't know your story and you don't know my story. So, if we think about that idea that our snap judgments are made about what is visually apparent, so what's seen, and then also the behavior, how are they acting when it comes to a mental health diagnosis. you know Very often there might be some way that that person's behavior is influenced by a symptom that they're experiencing. And if someone's not educated about what something like autism might look like or something like OCD might look like, what do those symptoms look like, we might make the assumption that that person's behaviors in that moment have to do with who they are as a person and who they will be to me versus a symptom that they're just experiencing.
That was incredibly well put. I'm so glad that you chimed in at that moment because I think that really sets the tone. That encouragement to get beyond that first snap judgment and
Yeah.
accepting that we all have it.
Mhm.
I can remember being in grad school for occupational therapy where,
Mhm.
for the most part, it's a room of do-gooders, people who want to do good in the world.
Right.
And having to admit that we come into every situation with these biases is very hard for people, and to just know, like, it's not just you, everybody has it. And yours is going to be different than mine, is going to be different than the next person, which is why, you know, I can do the work that I do and Megan can do the work that she does. And we might not ever be able to switch places because, you know, or, you know, it might be more difficult for us to do that. So I so appreciate that perspective. Thank you. Any other questions or thoughts for Megan? That was a lot to think through. And I know I was saying before we started the group today, that, you know, right now racial equity is really having its moment, which is fantastic. I look forward to, you know, when every group has their moment. But that really is a big part of what the work that people need to do, is recognize the biases that they bring, and then they can get to that next step. So can't really skip that step, I don't think.
Mm-mm.
Yeah, so so we talked about what types of disabilities are, but what's most important, and this is where, you know, I hold this value as a human being, but I, you know, very much hold it as an occupational therapist, where we're all about participation and inclusion. So disabilities can affect all areas of life, including, and some of this is occupational therapy jargon, but activities of daily living, which are things like getting dressed and bathed and feeding yourself and those kinds of things, like the really basic self-care activities. Instrumental activities of daily living are things like shopping and money management and getting an education. So kind of self-care, but on a higher level. We've got education, work, play, leisure, and social participation. So this is these are the domains that occupational therapy, in theory, tries to address, try to improve people's lives in those areas. And there may be others. This may or may not make sense to your brain. This is my life's work, so it makes sense to me. Are there thoughts about this, or other ways that you would think to look at, you know, how do disabilities affect people's lives?
I don't have anything additional to add, but I would like to take a moment to really think about, you know, so the one that really strikes for me is the instrumental activities of daily living. Um, and even just the activities of daily living, like, you know, so many of us wake up and put our pants on and take a shower and make our breakfast, and it's seamless for us, and we don't struggle with that. And um, I think back to, for the folks that are leadership Seacoast alum that are on this call today, may have participated in an activity called Walk a Mile that was facilitated by the United Way, where we would really put ourselves in another person's shoes and identify some of the barriers that someone has to overcome just to do very simple activities, like getting a bus from Farmington to Rochester to go to the welfare office to seek rent assistance. And that act in and of itself is a challenge, but then think about all the things they had to do before that just to even be able to get the appointment and their paperwork together and all of the things that they need to bring with them. And they don't have transportation and they need to get on a bus, and it's not easy. So when I think about the group of individuals that we're talking about today, I think of it through that sort of that same lens, like, you know, the challenges that exist and the barriers that are there. And, you know, that we just need to be cognizant of that and to recognize that it's not easy. And what can we do differently, just as individuals and as a community, to recognize that, A, and then B, is there things that we can do to make it easier?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think you're right. If you're looking at this slide, the very top one, activities of daily living, is something that sort of happens within somebody's home.
Mhm.
And then some of the other, most everything else, we really can have a bigger, the world around them and the people with whom they interact can make a difference in many of those areas. And I do hope we'll have a chance to revisit some of the, for instance, your example, or kind of talk about what's involved. That I literally, like, almost like when you talked about the example of taking a bus and applying for I forget what you said, housing or Medicaid, or that could be a goal that we could work on at Krempel Center with somebody that could last over a year, and we may or may not be successful. I mean, it's that complex. So that, it's really quite amazing when you start looking at what people have to get through. So just wanted to say that. The next thing we want to talk about, oops, there's Todd. Isolation and becoming disengaged from society is a sad reality that comes with disabilities. It just doesn't need to be that way. I agree that that's the reality, Todd. And I hope we all can agree that it doesn't need to be that way. So thanks for sharing that. We were going to talk a little bit about, oops, we got some, hold on.
Especially in pandemic time, yes.
Yes,
Absolutely.
it's been very interesting. And this is just a wonderful anecdote, is that when things started to get locked down, our members were talking, we call our clients at Krempel Center members, and they said, you know what, we know how to do this. We've gone through this isolation when we had our injuries, and we go through it every day. How can we help everybody else who's now going through this? Which is pretty amazing.
Really amazing.
Lori distributed, I guess it was the confirmation for this event. There's some links in there to some things that Todd's written. And one was, I think it was April, Todd wrote a piece on isolation, because like you said, Todd's an expert on it. And all of a sudden the rest of us understand what that feels like.
Marginally.
So go back and click on those links after this session and read some of those pieces.
Yeah, so I'm going to switch to the next slide because we wanted to talk a little, just briefly, about people first language. Have people heard of that before? People first language or person first language? This is a little bit blurry, but it's a picture of Bigfoot. And there's somebody up a tree going, help, help, it's Bigfoot. And Bigfoot saying, I'm not Bigfoot, I'm just a person with large feet. So labels matter. So people first language emphasizes the individuality, equality, and dignity of people with disabilities. Rather than defining people primarily by their disability, people first language conveys respect by emphasizing the fact that people with disabilities are first and foremost just that, people. And I don't know if you can read the cartoon. This woman is saying to the gentleman in a wheelchair, so what do you prefer to be called? Handicapped, disabled, physically challenged? And he says, Joe would be fine. So the most appropriate label is usually the one that people's parents have given them. And I just loved this quote, which is, when we see the diagnosis as the most important characteristic of a person, we devalue that person as an individual. This is probably the biggest complaint that we get from our members, and the reason that they love to come to Krempel Center, because everybody has a brain injury. That is not the most interesting thing about them. You have to go deeper than that. Then it becomes like, whoa, what do you like to do? And hey, do you want to hang out sometime? So I'd love to hear Megan's or anybody else's perspective on this, because I think with mental health, like I said, I think the way that we may have the window into what symptoms or what challenges somebody's experiencing with mental health might be through their behavior, and then that ends up being problematic. Is this a good time for you to talk about that, Megan? You're muted.
I'm muted. That's I also wanted to acknowledge Susan's comment here about some, just bringing up intersectionality around when somebody, may belong to, be a person of color, a BIPOC community, and also live with a disability. So often terms that idea of intersectionality comes up there around, and for many people, it's the reality of having more than one difference, right? We kind of started the panel today with this idea that everybody's lives include nothing but difference from one another. But when your individual differences also put you in more than one group that may be oppressed by the larger culture, it's kind of a compound experience that you have, sometimes with one of your identities isolating you from the so if you're a person of color and feeling like none of the other people of color understand my disability, and then you're a person who identifies as having a disability and none of the other people in my community around my disability understand what it's like for me to also be a person of color, that's kind of like again, that compound experience of feeling isolated. But going back to this idea of person first language, I think this is something that the mental health field is, really, trying to move forward with. When you look at our ethics, even, we are ethically not supposed to be using language that does just this. We're not supposed to be writing our documentation and saying things like an autistic child or a bipolar woman. And yet, I think that while I know on my team, we are making a job of calling each other out on that kind of language, I would not be surprised at all as a consumer of mental health services to hear other people referring to me by my disorder. I think that that's probably still very common in the field, and something that has really been almost like ingrained in the profession. And I think part of the reason of that is the way that we structure healthcare in a way, the way that we use diagnosis as the first thing that we need to do in order to be able to provide billable service, is to find a label in a book that fits this person. And I remember my first psychopathology class in grad school. My professor took the word diagnosis and he said, let's look at this. And he said, really what this word says is to know through this lens. Diagnose, right? To know through this lens. So rather than saying this person, is this, can you just understand the way that this experience of major depressive disorder affects their life? Can you see it through that lens? And I remember really liking that at the time. But now, even when I look at that, I think, oh, but that's just one lens. What if I said, I'm going to look at you as a teacher because you're also a teacher. I'm going to look at you as a mother because you're also a mother. And what if I swapped those lenses out? So it's almost like we got, in the field, we got trained to kind of put these certain glasses on to see people. And really what we need is that when you go in for an eye exam, that what those fantastic things that they have that swap the lenses out, that's what we really need to be able to do. We need to constantly be swapping the lens out and say, well, what if I looked at this as if you were my mother? What if I looked at this as if you were my neighbor? And, I think that, the work that we're trained to do in the field can be very myopic, and just, your job is to treat this person for these symptoms. And something that is coming up in the field that I think is like a breath of fresh air is this idea of a strength-based approach of really saying, like, and I know that we really try to really hold on to that from our perspective around treatment planning, of saying, like, what do you want to work on what do you want me to help you with? You tell me what that is. I'm not going to tell you what you need to fix here. I'd like that to be a collaboration. And then also, what do you bring to the table that you think will be your strengths that help you with this? That is such a different conversation than me being prescriptive and saying, well, you've got this disorder and these are the things that you need to do to help you with this disorder. That could be so far off, far off target if I'm just making those assumptions and not letting that person guide me.
Absolutely. And I should have put in here the strengths-based approach, because
Mhm.
that's exactly what we use as well.
Mhm.
And it always takes a while for our members to kind of switch modes, because they've
Mhm.
come from the healthcare system that's trying to fix them. And
Right.
then they're coming to us and they're saying, well, I want to do this. And you're like, well, you can do that, because you've got this in place and that in place, and you've got this strength that's going to serve you really well, and you just need to buffer up a few little things, and here's like, let's do it. So you're right that our healthcare system, I don't necessarily think sets people up for the resiliency that they need, and the lens that they need to view themselves through. And for that reason, I think this forum is so important, because it comes down to the people in our society that really, if we can find it in ourselves to engage with people in a different way, that's going to be really, really helpful. So the person first language is tell what a person has, not what a person is. I love this one where they said, are you when you have a diagnosis of cancer, are you considered cancerous? Like,
Mhm.
or do you have cancer? So Bob has quadriplegia. He's not a quadriplegic. Emphasize abilities, not limitations.
I like
Sandy
Todd's
uses,
comment here that he's an architect, not a disabled architect.
right. Um, avoid negative words that imply tragedy. So some of the afflicted with, suffers, their victim, prisoner, and this is a big topic in the, I would say in the if there is such a thing as a disabled community,
Mhm.
where people aren't looking for pity.
Mhm.
They are looking for acknowledgement of what they put out in the world and the efforts that they make. But that's different from pity. So Mimi is living with a brain injury versus Mimi has suffered a brain injury. And the next one I put in here, and Megan, I'd love your input. Skip is living with schizophrenia, not Skip is crazy. And I
Mm.
still am trying to eliminate that word crazy from my vocabulary.
Yes, I love that you said that. We throw that word around so casually. Um, and it's such an interesting one to catch yourself when you hear yourself use that word and say, okay,
Oh,
well, what did I really mean? What was I actually trying to convey? Was I trying to say chaotic? Was I trying to say
unorganized,
unorganized? Was I trying to say like actually kind of wild and fun? It
overwhelmed.
yeah, it can be used for so many different things, but it does have such a negative connotation. This other one that I've been thinking about actually comes more from I have two kids, and they're 6 and 10, and we talk a lot about language that's appropriate. It's kind of the name of the game is like, what can you say, what can you not say? And they both have ridden the school bus in the past, so they've got expansive vocabularies about words they shouldn't say now. But one of the words that we call them out on a lot is just the word stupid, and it's used in such a derogatory way. And I challenge them and I say, you're saying stupid, and what you mean is bad. What you mean is, I don't like that, or I'm feeling really hateful of that right now. But you're using this word that actually is talking about someone's ability to learn, and that has nothing to do with their goodness. Why do you think you're using that word? But then I think, oh, of course, because if I'm a child and if I'm working my way through an educational system, my ideas about goodness are really connected with, am I good at school, right? So I think from a very young age, we have these very, able centric, or, really like high, just this construct that smart is, smart in a certain way, not even smart in a well-rounded way, but smart in a school way is very preferable to somebody that's not doing well in school. And I think that just similar to using the word crazy, we use these words to mean often just something negative or something bad.
And the only, so again, based on the cartoon, was ask people how they would like you to refer to them if needed. If there's a situation where, say, you're going to be, doing some advocacy or being somebody's voice, then it would be important to ask that question. But often just calling them by their name, is there a reason that you need to label them? I can't say enough that people first language is not just political correctness. And I think that that's a really, I had an incident with my brother recently where I called him out on using language, and he was like, it's just a bunch of PC bullshit. And I'm like, it is so not. The power of your words cannot be overstated. So that is such, to me, that's a cop out when you say, I don't care, I'm not so worried about all this PC stuff. It's truly a cop out.
It's privilege too. It means that doesn't affect me in a way, right?
Correct. Exactly. Which is my favorite definition of privilege is doesn't bother you because it doesn't affect you. So this is for probably later on, but I wanted to, thinking about how hard could it be for people to do some of these things. And I think that'll be a discussion for later on. And I'm going to go back to Lori to kind of, open to comments, questions about kind of language and what we're talking about. And Lori, I'm going to pass it back to you to get us, tell us where we are.
We'll bring
and
it.
I'll unshare.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, let's bring it back to center. And it's fine that we're not completely on track on time because of the size of the group. I think it's going to be fine. But does anybody have any comments or questions that they want to bring up at this point about anything that's been shared thus far? Becky, are you cold?
I am
She
absolutely
is.
freezing. Yes, I have more coffee brewing. One thing that I wanted to talk about that, Lori, I think you could relate to this is using those terms in fundraising. Barb, yeah, right. So Barb brought up such a great point about referring to members as individuals living with brain injury. And I can tell you that does not translate to an appeal very well. Brain injury survivors translates very well. And we have, I'm constantly trying to figure out how to balance those things. I had a conversation actually with our founder once about it, and he was very flippant about it and be like, we're all survivors. Brain injury survivors are fine. Not for him to define what everybody is feeling, but it was definitely something where I have to walk that line between what is going to grab at people's heartstrings and then what's just inappropriate.
Becky, we deal with the same thing as well as, we have residents at the shelter, not clients, but then that sounds like we're providing long-term housing, or we talk about people experiencing homelessness versus homeless people.
Right.
And but A, it makes for a very long sentence, and B, I mean, if you do writing, you understand. And then also it does pull that a little bit outside of, and does make it more difficult for people somehow to connect with when you're separating things out. But it's so important to say the right thing and to say things in a way that is not doing all of the bad things that we're trying to talk about not doing. So it can be super challenging.
I see an opportunity there. I see an opportunity to talk to your residents, for Becky, for you to talk to the members, to say, here's where, here's my job. Here's what I do for this organization. And, what do you, I struggle with how to talk about your experiences. I think it could be very interesting to have that kind of conversation and see where you could land.
Unfortunately, a lot of our members are too nice. As you know. And and I have learned that everything that I write, I put in front of Barb and the programming team is every single time I can possibly remember. And every single time I forget, it comes back to bite me. But yeah, and then if I write an appeal that includes a member, I send it to them first to approve as well, to make sure that we're referring to whatever is their situation in a way that they approve of, and that's how they want it referred to. And that was actually something that had to be taught to me, because it never would have occurred to me otherwise. It was the programming team who, once again, is like, all right, Beck, let's sit down and let's talk about this once again. And Barb, you have to help, because I don't remember any of the medical terms. That's in the thing where I'm like, here, please insert the important words. One of our members, I think I referred to her as having a brain bleed. And Sarah on the programming team was like, that's not how she refers to what happens to her. And of course, brain bleed was something that was very relatable. People can imagine it. It works well in an appeal, but it wasn't something that we could use because she refers to it as an alter something.
Oh, ulterior, anterior malformation,
That's
venous
it.
malformation, yeah.
See, this is what I mean. So I'm
Right.
like, okay, so brain bleed, which I thought translated so much better to an appeal. And they were like, no. And so I had to reword the sentence some to make it work, which, like you said, is incredibly important. I'd rather do that than get use the short way out.
I would love to continue on this conversation, and we certainly can. And I'm just thinking off the top of my head, because I know I was challenged with the same thing that you both are talking about when working at Haven with victims of domestic violence, and are they survivors or victims, and I think it's a process. That's my first inclination, is that this is a long process. And from a fundraising standpoint, there's a limited amount of time that someone's going to read a letter and take action, right? Or see an email and click and donate money. But if we could have an opportunity to use the phrase "also known as" or "previously referred to," just like a short snippet of words to sort of weave in that educational piece and start planting the seed with the donors that we're not going to be using this language for much longer, so you hop on board, like a subliminal message to them that this is how they used to be referred to, but we're going to be referring to them more culturally appropriately, or something like that.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's so true, and that speaks to so much more that is like we're just scratching the surface today. Because that means that those people are sitting and staying in a space that they're comfortable in, and not perhaps recognizing that they need to be expanding their awareness and knowledge and shifting.
I think there's something also. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Hi, Bridget.
Bridget.
Hi, how are you, Lori?
Yeah.
I was just going to say that to kind of piggyback on that, I think that's a good opportunity to educate some people on equity that normally might not be having that conversation or that experience, for that it's important for different groups, and it's not just PC. This is just explaining, this is what they used to be called, this is what they would prefer to be thought of, because and using the example of when you have cancer, you're not cancerous.
Right.
So I love that example. But anyway,
That's a great example. And I would also say, like, this is a topic we could have a whole session just on people first language. In the class of 2020, and 2019 would have gotten it too. John Burns, who is the executive director of SOS. Yeah, why can't I think of what SOS stands for? Oh my gosh,
It's not
anyway,
sure.
but you all are familiar. It's he runs an organization to assist those who are experiencing drug abuse, misuse challenges. So he would kill me right now if he saw this, that I can't remember what SOS stands for. He'd actually have all of us that know him. So he, in one of our days last year, talked about appropriate language to use with the community in which he works. And two of the graduates of the class of 2020, at the end of the program, when we say, now that I know I am going to, used that specific information that he provided. One was an attorney. He is changing the way he speaks about his clients in the courtroom and to his clients specifically, to really change that dynamic so that everybody is speaking more appropriately and with more support and grace and understanding that these are individuals that are experiencing a challenge. And then another woman who is in the medical field and does a lot of ethics review on cases, is also incorporating that concept of person first language. So it was really remarkable, we're including it as just a segment of today's conversation. We really could expand that and have an entire day on this. Strength over stigma. Thanks, Liz. We got it. Anyway, Megan, I know you were going to say something too.
No, I so appreciate this this reflection from you, Becky, because it's not something I would ever, within my lens, right? It's not something I would have ever thought about. Oh, how does this affect somebody, who's looking to fund essentially and like support an organization, right? But there's also, I guess, a part of me that just says like, this is really interesting because it feels like it's a great example of this idea of equity where what's being asked for is like equal space and equal representation at the table. And then this idea of like the need for, we're talking about exchanging money, right? Which is like, can we get any closer to the power structure, right? How people spend their money is a huge, and who has and who doesn't, right? And we're talking about how maybe the way that people want to or have been taught to think about the right way to support people that have less or have less access is to be thinking about them in these ways that it centers out of compassion, but maybe also pity, maybe also a sense of like thinking about emphasizing the difference, and in a way that hits emotional tones when the actual groups might be saying like, you don't need to get emotional over me, like I just want to be treated fairly, like I would just like you to support my cause because it's an important cause, and I don't need you to have to come to me in a really empathic way, I just want fair treatment. But I think that might make people feel like, oh well that makes me a little bit more aware of maybe I wasn't, and again, of bias or privilege, and then I feel a little bit less comfortable.
I think that-
And Lori, I just wanted to make one real quick comment just around language, and I hear where Becky and Jess and anybody who has to write some of this stuff. I don't always specifically do fundraising, but I'm in the nonprofit world and it comes up. But I think also too, a lot of stories, not necessarily from the nonprofits, but like out in like news and articles where people with disabilities who do something are portrayed as heroic, or they're this kind of put on a pedestal. Not that what those accomplishments aren't great, but I think there's this way like was able to overcome, and there's sort of this sort of superhero or sort of like, isn't it amazing that somebody with this is able to do that? And I just remember years ago hearing people talk about this, and it's such a good reminder to stop and think about that. And so I just throwing that out there because all of this is such a good reminder just in day to day, and any of us in communications, I think. So thank you for that.
I'm going to jump onto that comment actually, Susan, with something I hear from parents all the time is the thing that they hate the most is when people say to them, oh, like some kind of version of, well, you were chosen to have a special child because, you know, because you're special, or God only gives you as much as you can handle. And people, you know, parents, I'm hearing it so much, like, no, it's just my kid. Like, if you had this kid, you would figure it out too. And this is not because I'm special. This is just what I'm doing for my child. But again, that need, and I think it's a way to say, again, not me, right? It's a little bit of a way to other that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Todd, I'm wondering if you have any comments to share about what Susan was just referring to, that like as an individual who's impacted with a disability, like, do you ever get that treatment? Like, if you do something that is not necessarily like this huge, triumphant, magnificent, sorry, there was snow falling off of my roof, activity or moment, that you're treated as if you've just like won an Olympic medal to some degree. I'm sure he's typing in the chat box now. And yeah, Megan, that whole, I know that when you and I chatted, we were talking about that feeling of being othered. And yeah, how quick do we as a society quickly push someone else away when it's not our experience, but we want to find nice ways to do that. Like, oh, it's because you're special.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, that's, ugh, that gives me the heebie-jeebies.
You
So,
know, Todd and I, as access navigators, we've picked up some nice little awards over the last couple of years, and I do wonder, would Megan have as much luck as we have when it's an invisible disability? I do think we get championed a lot because people want to like what we're doing. It, you know, it's we're very politically correct, and I think we get kudos for that. That some groups may deserve more than we do, but we're easier to like.
I think it goes back to stigma too, right?
Yeah, there's less stigma to some of the physical disabilities. I think, I could be wrong because I don't live with one, and so when, you know, when Todd responds here, you may hear something different from him, but I certainly feel like people just think we're the darlings of the, you know, helping people with disabilities.
So Todd responded and he said, someone once said to me, there by the grace of God I go, or yeah, I go, which was the insensitive thing someone said to me. So yeah, you know, I don't think it's an undertone of trying to be sensitive and kind, but in reality, if you step back and really analyze that, that's not really the right thing to say.
Right.
And I was wondering if you could give us a few statistics. I know that you had prepared some information.
Yeah, I have statistics queued up here. Let's see, let me get to my buttons again.
One thing that I'm hoping we'll have a chance to talk about is, you know, it's well, first of all, when we were preparing for this, we talked a little bit with Todd. You know, I kind of asked the question, are folks who have invisible disabilities often feel like they are having difficulty because people overestimate their abilities? And Todd confirmed that for him, and I think other people that I know that are living with physical, more visible disabilities, that their abilities are underestimated. And I think that this glorifying accomplishments comes from that sense of like, oh, wow, like that's amazing that they did that, because clearly they can't be all that capable, right. You know, so that's an interesting thing. But I also think one of the things I'd love to talk about, because I think it really impacts this group, is not everything we see when somebody's struggling. When people are struggling, you and I and everybody, we're not always the prettiest of human beings. Our behavior may not be very pretty, and how can we not? How can we get past that snap judgment of that's really poor behavior, and I'm going to call that person on the behavior, to want to see if there's something else going on for that person. I have heard the word grace so many times today, and that seems like a really great message. So I'd love to just, if anybody's interested in talking about that, I think it's a great discussion point.
Yeah, and I'll just flip through these statistics quickly, because I think we all think we're talking about other people, but the reality is when you start to see these statistics and understand how many people live with some kind of disability, 26% of people, of adults in the United States, 2 in 5 adults age 65 and over. I always found this a really impactful statement that disabilities make up the world's largest minority group, and any of us on this call could be part of this group later today or tomorrow. So that this is just the stat on, you know, how long you typically spend living with a disability, and for all of us, the average is 8 years. So Todd is, of course, above average, as he is with everything he does. And some of the rest of us haven't started our 8 years yet, or at least the average 8 years. So it's just kind of something to think about, these kind of statistics. Oh, wait, there's one more here. I'm checking on slides. Oh, here we are, Rockingham County. Almost 30,000 people in our own county. So it, I think this all kind of hits at home.
For sure. Yeah, it's not a small group of individuals that we're
Not a small group.
about. And as you were saying in our preparatory meeting, the concept and the language around someone who's impacted with a physical disability, because it's often in physical or not, someone with a disability, it impacts more than just the individual. It impacts the people that live with that person, that work with that person. So it goes beyond just the individual. It's really
Well, Todd crafted those words. We said, for a long time, we said people living with disabilities, and then he changed it up to say it's people impacted by disabilities, because his son and his friends and his coworkers, we're all impacted by Todd's disability. When JSA plans a Christmas party, which we're not this year, but years that we do, we look for a venue that's accessible. So we're impacted by needing to accommodate Todd. We also just like to give our money to restaurants that are accessible, whether it's going along or not. You know, vote with your money, vote with your dollars. Todd also posted in here, it's common that people assume he is cognitively challenged, and so they talk slow and use simple words because he uses a wheelchair. I know they mean well, they just have no clue how to communicate with someone who's different from them. So, you know, that's insightful, and I've traveled with Todd, and it is so true. We've been in restaurants, and the waiter looks at me to find out what Todd wants to have for dinner. You're like, what's that?
Yeah.
So what do you do in that moment, Anne? Do you say to the waiter, you know, that you're more than welcome to address Todd specifically, individually? Like, what's
I just nod to Todd, and he'll either already has it, you know, often Todd has it queued up, and he's going to say it.
Right.
Or we've got menus in front of us, you point, or Todd, what do you? I maybe have slipped and said, oh, I think he's going to have a beer. Then he's going to have to tell the waiter which beer. And it's going to be an IPA. Oh, guess what? We learned people who live with disabilities also drink beer. That was, we giggle about that because we did put out a beer map of accessible breweries. That was a couple of years ago. That got some traction, and it was almost a little bit tongue in cheek. Like, who knew that people who live with disabilities also do the normal things that the rest of us do?
Right.
That, which, you know, your comment about Todd's actually allowed to have a beer.
Allowed to have a beer.
This is, and I'm gonna get the word wrong, the phrase wrong, because it's just slipping. It's not right to risk. What? Is anybody? We tend to be very paternalistic towards folks with disabilities, and that there is a lot of there's a lot of pushback around, like, we have the same right to take risks that
Right.
you do.
Mhm.
So that's a really interesting point, is like, we're doing this, are we doing it to make ourselves feel better? Are they allowed to make a risk? You know, I'm allowed to go and take a risk. I'm allowed to go and swim across the lake without, you know, proper safety procedures, and no one's gonna give me a real hard time. But with folks with disabilities, we often take away their right to do that. So that's just another very paternalistic
Well,
approach.
you know, on the beer thing at JSA, I always say back in the olden days, we had, and hope to have again, this great guy that comes in once a week with his, I don't know what assistant, his person. I don't know what you call them, counselor. TJ is 26 years old. He came to us from a school for children with autism, which the name escapes me. It's in Portsmouth.
Green Guard?
He went through Green Guard. Before Green Guard, he was with the one where younger children are.
Yep. White.
Anyway, came to us as a work experience, and he comes in once a week. He takes out our recycle, and it's awesome. Great job for him. He also does something. He did something at Shaw's too before all the shutdown. But we got to know him, and we asked maybe last year, like, we want to give him a Christmas present. What should we give him? And his aide said, "Oh, he really loves IPA from Stoneface. You should get him, get him a 4-pack of IPA. He'd be thrilled, because that's where we go at the end of the day, and that's where we meet. I meet back up with his parents, and that's like the pass office. They have a little happy hour at IPA." And there were people in our office who were horrified that this guy was allowed to go to Stoneface and have a beer. He's
Oh my
26
gosh.
years old. He's mostly nonverbal. He's a wonderful kid, but why would, and it did make you sit back and go, well, why can't he go have a beer? Why would you think he can't go have a beer when he's with his family and his aide, and it's his
Where
pleasure
did
at the
that
end of the
come
day?
from? Megan, do you know where that come? Like, what is that? We all seem to possess it, right? It's not like are we born like, or is it something that's been modeled that we're just following? I mean, where did that come
think, yeah, I guess one of the things that's tricky is with something like autism that we would classify as a neurodevelopmental disability, we make a lot of assumptions about somebody's, I guess I want to use the word cognitive development. So sort of like what age, like where we're making assumptions about their cognitive abilities, but then we're kind of strangely putting it on this developmental map. And something like someone being nonverbal, I would imagine, makes a lot of people make assumptions about their cognitive abilities, like Todd was mentioning. And then also if they have some traits of autism that maybe involve some behaviors that are confusing to people, that also may make somebody make that snap judgment. Okay, here's a 26-year-old man and he needs this kind of support and assistance, and he's nonverbal, and maybe he's giving me some behavioral cues that make me confused. So I'm going to kind of infantilize him, and I'm going to think about him the way that I think about, a young child. And I'm going to then assume that he doesn't have the capacity to make decisions independently for himself. There are individuals for whom the right course of action to safely be, transitioning into adulthood will be for a loved one to take on some, guardianship around some decision-making rights. But it's almost like we've kind of taken that as the assumption whenever we see a difference like that. Oh, well, they must need the most extreme level of support, and they must not have any autonomy.
So that really goes back to that implicit bias that
I think
you
so.
talked about in the beginning. Okay.
So I have a question. How do you address, and Anne, how would you address your coworkers about something like that? When something like that came up, how do you address people's implicit biases in the workplace?
Todd, what did we do? I want to say that we didn't end up buying the beer. I want to say we gave him chocolate that year. Or did we buy him beer? I can't remember. It was a couple of years ago. And it was enormously biased. And
Mhm.
it wasn't like we, without his support team, were going to go take him out for beers. It was his own family that takes him for a beer. And it was just so odd to me that it created such a, yeah, oh, okay. We explained he was an adult. He's an adult, and he's not dumb.
Mhm.
He's got great mental capacity, and he's doing a lot using an iPad.
Yeah.
He does a lot, different category than Todd. They're both communicating using iPad, which, yay for iPad.
Yeah,
So we had an interesting, kind of along these same lines, had an interesting research project that a graduate student did at Krempel Center. We have this event called the King Challenge, which is a bike ride. And as part of that bike ride, the public, can participate, and it's got multiple lengths, a 10 and a 30 and a 60-mile route. And in addition, we hire Northeast Passage, which is a adaptive sports organization, to work with our members. And so a woman who was studying therapeutic recreation did a study last year with our members who participated in this bike event. And it was the training. We offered training opportunities leading up to the event, and then we offered the event. And it was a separate course because a closed course. Members were able to ride on the regular course if they felt able to, although I will say there were opinions rendered about whether or not they were able to. And what came out of this research was, and then we had this closed loop that was a half-mile loop that people could ride. And it is, a lot of our members will say it's their favorite day of the year. They love it. It's so much fun. Part of it is there's a beer garden that they can actually, no one tells them they can't go in and have a beer. But this research showed that their sense of self-efficacy, their sense of being able to make things happen that they want to have happen, actually declined as a result of this participation. With the idea, and I haven't examined it closely yet, I just heard about this last week. I was like, oh my gosh, the idea that here's this world was open to them of sports, and yet it's not really accessible to them. First of all, sometimes people are telling them what they can and can't do. We had rented the bike, so that's something that they don't really have the money to do. They can't really just go out for a ride on their own. They have to be in a controlled environment. So something that I still think it's great in many ways, and I know that because people do say it's one of their favorite days. But the impact is really mixed, and that's fascinating. So that talks about right to take risk, talks about needing to rely on other people to participate in activities that are meaningful. So while they really appreciate this opportunity, it also brings to mind that every other day of the year that those opportunities aren't available, that they're reliant on other folks for those opportunities, and sometimes being not allowed to have those opportunities based on other people's opinions. So that's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, that is really fascinating. And that's kind of a nice segue to talking about, Barb, it was kind of like what you had on your last slide. Like if we sort of imagine what it would be like to go to the grocery store, to go to a brewery, what does that look like for people? And just sort of expand upon a little bit of the conversation that we're already having right now, like that we tend to seem to think that we have to provide additional assistance when it's really not needed, that these people have the ability and capabilities.
I have slides queued up for that topic. If you
Well,
want
let's
me to
just dive right in.
hit it. Because it'll be pictures.
I love pictures.
I know. Okay, here we go. And this one is Todd's to talk to. And there is, for you who can only see his head and shoulders right now, there's the whole Todd reaching for the door at the brewery.
Oh, there he is, going for an
There he is.
IPA.
Yeah, and that's a tricky building to get in and out of. There's stairs immediately, right?
Well, that's the whole gist of Access Navigators, is that we figured out the trick, and none of those front entries work, even though the brewery did think that entry Todd's reaching for is the entry to their little gift shop side.
Okay.
And then you can go through the gift shop and there's a back dining room there, but that back dining room doesn't have an accessible restroom. So it's problematic. It also doesn't have TV sets to watch the ball game. It doesn't have any of that. And so we learned when we went and investigated that there's actually an unmarked door beside the dumpster out back. And that is a perfect accessible entrance. And
And bonus, you get to go by the dumpster.
You get to go by the dumpster. The reality is it's actually, most places I hate the idea of a back door by the dumpster, but here, because it is adjacent to the parking garage, and the parking garage has such a beautiful curved rampway to get down to that back door, it's not the terrible entry that a back dumpster door normally is. So we don't hate that one. What I hate is that we've been told for a couple of years that they're going to actually mark that door as the accessible door, and it still hasn't happened. So I have bought a sticker, and I'm going to take it in and say, you know, here you go, because it's hard to figure out which door.
I was going to say, how hard is that to mark the door? Like that it
It's
would
not
take
hard. I
years.
bought a sticker on Amazon for like $2, and it would really just be in my car right now. It'll make it down there one of these days. And Todd, do you have narrative for this slide? I think you do. And you're muted if you're using your iPad. I know, multiple buttons. Or, no, you're still, oh, there you go. You're off mute now.
I grew up a Midwesterner, but when I discovered Portsmouth and moved here from Dallas 30 plus years ago, I fell in love with the historic downtown. It wasn't until I was in a wheelchair that I noticed all the steps, uneven surfaces, and the labyrinth of obstacles everywhere I turned.
I think I'd love to take a look at that last picture of Todd trying to get into that door, and imagine, like, we don't know anything about, let's assume this is just some random person living with a disability, and what other issues could happen. First of all, they had to get there to begin with. Can they navigate there? Can they drive? Do they have transportation? Once you get in, what a you know, that beyond the physical environment, can you order? You know, do you have the communication skills to order? Is the menu legible to you? Is it too much to try to navigate? Is it too many choices to have to make? Can you understand the different, you know, that the thing that you want on the kids menu, you know, that there's a kids menu and an adult menu. There's money management, there's decision making. It's an incredibly complex task that if you have cognitive issues on top of that, or maybe mental health issues, sensory issues, where it might be too noisy, there might be a lot of white noise, or the lights might be very bright. And if any of you have ever felt that, like on the edge, you want to get out of your body, of being kind of, that's what some people live with, this sense of sensory overload and how frustrating that is. And then it becomes a matter of having to control your behaviors. So, and I think, Megan, you may have more to add, but there's so much that goes into what we would consider a simple task, and so many pitfalls and so many areas where things might not go well.
And then what we're looking at here, that was just the brewery on the first slide.
Wow.
Now you've got an entire downtown that you're trying to navigate, and you really don't know what to expect.
Wow.
So I'm just going to blow quickly through what it is that Access Navigators tries to do to help people who live with physical disabilities. We've come in and we've looked at, we're looking at towns all over Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and beyond, But right now, this looking at restaurants thing obviously is a little bit on hold. But when we are busy doing this, we're looking at the public entrance, interior travel path, the restrooms, and the parking. And we'll just sort of do a quick little trip down the good, the bad, and the ugly. There's great entrances. There's less great entrances. There's entrances that you can't enter at all. It's not that hard, really, on a lot of buildings to figure it out. But some in our historic downtowns you can't. We're stuck. And then we're grateful for people like that is, in fact, Stoneface Brewery, which not a pretty building, but my gosh, they did a fantastic ramp. On the insides of restaurants, we're looking for clear travel path between tables and also looking for standard height tables. That's the old RERA in the lower right, and their high top tables meant that your food or drink was up at the level of your nose if you're sitting in a wheelchair. Restrooms, always the good, the bad, and the very ugly. Sometimes there's great restrooms, but the hallway to the restroom is blocked. That's what we're seeing with the student in the upper left. Or the poolside clearance is blocked and you can't access the door. Or lower right, brand new restroom, it's really nice. What is that little piece of furniture doing there? It meant that the turning radius to do a transfer from your wheelchair to the toilet is blocked. And so it became an inaccessible restroom only because that cute little bench thing is there. And then, of course, winter comes, and this is Todd's least favorite season of the year because all of it. So the horrors of all that. When we looked around Portsmouth, we were surprised. There's the brewery on the left, and it is the go round back, and there's the door around back. It's not a terrible door, it's just an unmarked door. So we tell people to look for the green door beside the dumpster thing. CO's Gelato built a countertop inside the window that is actually the right height for people who use wheelchairs, which was so, and they did it intentionally, knew what they were doing, which is really cool. River House has a ramp that you can ask for. Chestnut Street used to be a terrible place for anyone with any kind of mobility impairment. But the redo that the Music Hall and the City of Portsmouth put together took away all the curbs, all the obstacles, and it took away the step to get into the Music Hall. So that was a very thoughtful fix there. So Todd and I realized we did the City of Portsmouth and realized we had a thing here and it needed to expand, but it was just the two of us. And that wasn't going to happen very easily. And so we are partnered, we first partnered with University of New Hampshire, and we teach a public health nursing project every fall. And those nurses choose towns and they collect data for us. We also have a nice little group of retired people. You don't have to be retired, but people who have time on their hands who have taken a look at their hometowns for us. And then we expanded to other universities. So we have a fairly robust collection of people willing to go into restaurants and collect data for us once this is all over. So we are probably a year or so out from being back in gear again. So what did we do this year? Instead of sitting still, well, we did sit still, but in probably July, we realized we had an opportunity in downtown Portsmouth when all the outdoor dining came into place. A lot of it was not actually accessible to a person using a wheelchair. So when you look, this is Durbar Square. I mean, this honestly is just no fault of theirs. This is what the city handed them. The Jersey barriers plus the curb meant you really couldn't get into their dining area. There were quite a few areas like this that I referred to them as little bathtubs because they're just boxed in the whole way around. Next year, we hope to do a better job on this. But what we did as access navigators was we went around and we found the outdoor dining that was accessible and did have a path to an indoor restroom, and we posted them on our Facebook page. And then we took those posts and we shared them to the two famous Portsmouth Facebook pages. We shared them to Seacoast Eats, and every time we would share them, we would get between 8,000 and 10,000 views of these little reviews that we were writing about restaurants. So we were not only giving shout outs to places that were accessible, but I mean, we were helping the economy of these restaurants. And this is an office outing from a couple of years ago, obviously pre-COVID. I just always love this because it's hard to tell. It's sort of like, where's Wally? Where's the guy that has the disability? I'm not sure which one he is. And Todd, do you have a comment queued up for this one too? I think you did.
People with disabilities is not a charity. Of course, it's the right and ethical thing to do, but it makes business sense as well. For example, when I go out, I don't go alone. I often am joined by a host of friends or coworkers. It's not just a lone individual you're accommodating, it's also their family and friends. I should also point out that New Hampshire has the second oldest median age in the country. As we all know, with age comes impairment, so it's never a good idea to alienate a significant demographic. I spoke last year on that topic at the International Conference on Global Aging in Toronto, but we'd need a lot more time to dig into that.
And then I just have a wrap-up slide, which Todd, I think you've got the narrative on this one too.
A few weeks ago, I sat through 9 hours of listening to a Boston business group talk about equity and inclusiveness in the workplace, and in the end, there was no mention of hiring or accommodating individuals with disabilities. I certainly can appreciate the need for gender and racial inclusion, but the 26% of Americans living with disabilities surely deserve to be included in the conversation.
Yeah, so true, right?
Back to our Hollywood Squares.
Thank
Todd.
you, Ann and Todd. So I just want to be recognizing that we've got about 15 minutes left. One point I would like to make with regard to accessibility, and I will share out these links again with everyone who's here on this call. One piece of information research that we came across was that really if you're building a diversity, equity, and inclusion plan, that accessibility should be your starting point, not something that you try to weave in later on. And I think that that mark has been missed probably more often than not. And Anne and Todd, I'm wondering if you can sort of touch on, I think perhaps the majority of individuals in our society think that this is something that's sort of being managed by the ADA, and that this sort of on the ground work isn't quite necessary.
Right. You know, I normally have a couple of slides in the deck about the ADA, and I've kind of made this really abbreviated because of the time and having to share the platform here. The ADA is a really great start. It's a launching point. It doesn't come close to real life for a lot of people. I sometimes use the example of our own office building. We were not the architects for it. Let me just throw that out there. The whole way across the front of the building, there's pretty many accessible parking spaces. I couldn't tell you. It's a multi-tenant building. We're out at Pease. The building is, I don't know, 15, 20 years old, I guess, something like that. Old enough that it's in the ADA time frame. And so there's this nice batch of accessible parking spaces out front. And all of this is completely legal. Like this is fine. And then on the side of the building, there was an entrance with one of the power assist buttons, the little blue button with the wheelchair icon on it. But the side of the building with the power assist buttons didn't actually have any accessible parking spaces. They were all out front. And you're just sort of like, well, wait a minute, it's legal and I think you don't have to have a power assist button. It was just an odd juxtaposition of all of this and that, and it wasn't really accomplishing. I will jump in and say our landlord was awesome, and we dedicated a parking space for Todd, and when we moved to the other side of the building, he added more power assist buttons and more parking spaces and all of that, but it just, wasn't terribly thoughtfully laid out from the get-go.
It's an afterthought. It's not part
Yeah,
of
it was
the
kind of
actual plan.
Yeah, the power assist button was kind of an afterthought. I can see that Todd is furiously typing away there. ADA was adopted 30 years ago, and right, we're lagging behind in creating inclusion. I think people also think that ADA compliance, a lot of times it's not very attractive. It's some big metal ramp going into something. It's not pretty. You know, I could give you a whole slideshow on all these beautiful designs. You don't even realize they're accessible, but they are. Any thoughts towards the movement towards age-friendly communities and states? Maine and Massachusetts, and New Hampshire's trying. Some of the regional planning commissions have giant initiatives on it. I know the Southern New Hampshire Regional Planning Commission is partnered with AARP, and they're working through those 7 or 8 domains of age-friendly cities. New Hampshire's a tough place for people to age. Public transportation is a problem. Housing is a problem. And I don't really have answers for that. But I think your question was the ADA, and yeah, even
You can't just rely on
can't
that.
just rely on it. You know, even here in Portsmouth, it's so disappointing. We'll see a brand new restaurant open up downtown. And so I scurry in and, you know, I know it's going to be all okay because they've just blown out the interior on a brand new fit out. And the building inspectors have looked at it. And then I go in and it's missing the 3rd grab bar in the restroom. And I'm like, wait, what just happened here? It's brand new. Brand new fit. I mean, obviously downtown, not a brand new building usually, sometimes.
Right.
But we miss things. Our own building inspectors miss things and don't quite get what the difference between ADA and building code really is. ADA is law. It's not a building code.
Right. That distinction is really
It's law. There's so many nuances. There's the, oh golly. Actually, I always just hand out the 800 number for the New England ADA Center when somebody asks for advice. I'm not your person for technical advice, but there are rules on renovations. The Wilder would be an example. There's this 80-20 rule. You'd be like, why when the Wilder renovated from, who were they before? That second
Coat of
floor.
arms.
Coat of Arms.
Yeah.
Why weren't they required to put in an elevator? Because that's a completely inaccessible restaurant. So why no elevator? But there's this 80-20 rule on a renovation, and I sometimes don't say this right, so Todd might have to correct me, but if you're going to spend $100,000 on a renovation, you don't have to spend more than 20% of that on accessibility. So you do this like best I can. There's a legal phrase for it, but you do whatever you can with that money. And so probably there's an accessible restroom at the Wilder. Actually, I think there is, but they can't get an elevator for that 20%. And their renovation was very minor that they did upstairs. So there are all these nuances. The doorway at Cafe Killam is a little too narrow, but they haven't renovated. They would have to do a big blowout renovation to make that doorway have to be challenged and widened a little bit. And even with that, you know, we kind of give Killam a pass. They have a great restroom. Their threshold is smooth. The doorway is only 28 inches, but Todd's wheelchair is only 24 inches. So he could get into Cafe Killam, whereas somebody else, like a big power chair, maybe can't. So like on our review, we would just call out the dimension, not that it's bad. We would just say doorway is 28 inches. So, you know, just know that before you go. So lots of nuances to ADA. The rule book is extremely thick, like thick.
So Debbie just brought up that she's the marketing manager for a nonprofit in Maine and is in charge of the website. She's been researching how to make it ADA compliant, and it's been eye-opening, no pun intended, to realize how much online. What's that?
That's a whole nother category.
Whole nother topic, exactly.
Yeah.
It's a big topic. It's a big topic. I had no idea until I started researching it. It was like, whoa. And how
our IT guy just added an icon in the corner of our Access Navigator's website. It's the little wheelchair icon, and when you click that, something happens that I should know about.
It's probably like alternative text.
It does.
It's really interesting.
I fairly new that he added that to our website. I should be smarter about our own website.
Well, so the nonprofit I work for is a museum. And one of the things you consider is you look at our website and you think about, okay, every time there's a painting, there should be alternative text that describes exactly what is in that painting, not just the name of it or the artist, so that somebody who is vision impaired can find out what it is. And it really is very interesting. I mean, at first it was very overwhelming, but you think about our museums have to deal with accessibility. I mean, that's been a discussion in the museum field for years. And this is just sort of the easiest example beyond ramps and wide doorways. Many people now, that's how they're accessing museums during the pandemic, is on the web. So how can you make that experience user-friendly? And yeah, it's an interesting discussion. It's big.
Well, I think, the ADA and the changes that we can make to our environment, they're going to be rules that we have to, that people have to follow, and sometimes begrudgingly. And until we can change the attitudes and the true spirit, and people embrace the true spirit of inclusion, and we become that society that does value each and every person, none of that's gonna, those are band-aids, right? They're the concrete band-aids, they're the physical band-aids that can be done, but they're inadequate because it doesn't force people to embrace the spirit of inclusion.
I will say our giant online shift through the pandemic has been a giant boon for a lot of people who live with disabilities, Todd included. The shift to all these Zoom calls, it is huge. He and I have traveled together a lot to speaking gigs, and I gotta tell you, it's stressful. And this is a pleasure to just, Zoom in, and here we are, and we're on an equal playing field. And it's very equal because
it's an equalizer.
We look at all of us, and Todd doesn't look any different than the rest of us. I think there's a huge equalization for a lot of people with disabilities to be Zooming, if Zoom is appropriate to your disability. I know it doesn't work for everyone, but Barb, I know that you've done a lot of Zoom things. Oh yeah, you're right. Are you
Yeah,
you are the only male today. Where are the men?
Yeah, I thought about that as well. Interesting that I did
How
think
have your,
of the
I know
makeup
you've
of
been
this group.
Zooming. How are your members taking to all the
Well,
Zoom?
I think there are the folks who have transportation as a barrier, who are many of them are benefiting from it, but the cognitive and financial challenges of having access to technology and then having the ability to use it are huge barriers, huge barriers. And then, and Megan, I don't know if you guys are using any teletherapy.
Yeah,
but
so
it can be really hard for people to utilize it, I find.
Yeah, we, I think, have some folks that continue to struggle. I think I'm kind of lucky in the children's department because so many schools have made a great effort to make sure that all of their students have Chromebooks. So in some ways, the school has kind of helped the mental health system a little bit by making sure that students have Chromebooks in a lot of schools. So oftentimes when we're meeting with kids, we're talking to them through their school Chromebook. But we've, I would say we've noticed some positives because again, that transportation barrier, our no-show rates have gone down quite a bit across all of our clinicians on my team. And, a lot of that was just because sometimes life would get in the way. We have, a lot of clients that rely on the Medicaid funded transportation program. Sometimes the driver wouldn't come. Sometimes, a parent would forget to book the appointment 24 hours in advance. They remember to book the appointment, but not the transportation because there's so many moving parts to it. So I think that overall, moving to telehealth has probably increased engagement across. I don't know that we've quite figured out how to adapt. Like, I don't know if I'm loving play therapy across Zoom as much as I did in the office, that's for sure. But then we are also offering some in-person appointments, but now I'm suited up with an N95 and a face shield and goggles. So I think that might be even stranger for small children. Because I'm basically dressed like an astronaut. But it's all for just trying to find what works best for everybody. But I wanted to come back around to just this idea of like
just the concept of dignity and this idea of like all of these small moments, you know, when the world isn't accessible to you, being something where, you know, there's a level of cultural stress when the world throws a barrier up at you, and it impacts that kind of really important sense of personal dignity, that over time, a lifetime of experiences like that absolutely can result in somebody feeling a sense of isolation that can eventually, I think, move towards a feeling of, you know, some kind of trauma for people when you don't feel like you have access to your community. So I just wanted to name that too as we're rounding it out today, the importance of just having access to, you know, community and personal dignity.
Thank you. Yeah, that's so important. And that I do want to say it is 11 o'clock. So, you know, I'm happy to stay on if anybody wants to stay, but I do want to be recognizing that other priorities in the day probably are popping up for folks. But I want to thank the panelists, Barb, Ann, Todd, Megan. You guys have been a pleasure to get to know better. And I feel like we're just sort of scratching the surface on this conversation, and really look forward to including you perhaps in future Leadership Seacoast program days as it becomes relevant to the topic that we're discussing going forward. So thank you so very much. And thank you to the people that participated today. It's great to see your faces. Hopefully we'll be able to see you in person soon-ish, maybe in the spring of 2021. And one last plug, Leadership Seacoast is accepting applications for the class of 2021. So if you've been through the program and you loved your experience, please check out our website. There's a nomination form there. If you have not yet gone through our program and are interested, the website has tons of information. We also have a video about why you should apply. It's all located on the website, and I am always accessible at director@leadershipseacoast.org. So thanks so much.
Great.
Really great to see you.
Everybody.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
It was a
Bye.
pleasure.